Digital feudalism, or sovereign democracy, engineering resilient social systems. Let me begin not with a definition, but with a feeling that many people recognize and very few articulate well. There is a strange unease in the air. Not panic, not collapse, something subtler than that. A sense that we are still moving, still clicking, still choosing, but the choice itself is increasingly pre-shaped. That is the real discomfort, because if you can still choose, you can still believe you are free. But if the structure of choice has already been designed for you, then freedom becomes theatrical. It remains visible, but its substance thins out. And that, to me, is the defining issue of our time. And det to me zeigt today's not. In 2026, power does not always arrive with violence. It arrives with convenience. It arrives as recommendation, as frictionless access, as tailored relevance. It arrives with the soft voice of assistance. But beneath that softness is a more severe architecture, a system that learns your behavior, anticipates your response, and gradually makes dependence feel like autonomy. That is why the language of digital feudalism is not rhetorical decoration. It is an analytical description of what happens when technological systems capture agency without appearing to confiscate it. If you want a single image, picture a modern feudal map. At the top sit platform owners, infrastructure holders, and data aggregators. In the middle, sit the algorithms that allocate visibility, attention, and access. At the bottom sit the users, not as passive victims exactly, but as living sources of behavioral value. And around the whole structure is an invisible atmosphere of convenience that makes the arrangement feel natural. That is the trick. Naturalness becomes the costume of control. Yanis Varoufakis has been useful here because he forces us to see that we are no longer dealing only with classical capitalism in the old industrial sense. We are moving into a world where value is extracted not primarily from production, but from prediction, attention, and behavioral capture. That shift matters because it changes the moral and political center of gravity. The platform does not merely serve, it curates. It does not merely host, it shapes. It does not merely observe, it anticipates. And once anticipation becomes the core of power, the human being is no longer the sovereign author of the future, but a data source in someone else's architecture. That is why the loss here is not just economic, it is cognitive. Cognitive autonomy is not the same as having options. Everyone has options. A person can have 10,000 options and still not possess autonomy if the environment has been engineered to guide their attention, their emotional response, and their range of thought. Real autonomy means the capacity to reflect, to hesitate, to evaluate, to resist the first answer, and to remain internally authored. The moment a system begins to do too much of that work for us, we have crossed a threshold. The mind remains active, but it is no longer fully self-governing. Brecht understood something essential about this. He knew that the most powerful systems do not always dominate by force, they dominate by making their logic appear inevitable. There is a reason his theatre was so disruptive. He wanted the audience to stop sleepwalking through the performance of reality. One of his most famous lines, often attributed to him, is that art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. Whether one quotes it as exact or as paraphrase, the principle is clear. If you merely reflect the world, you can end up reproducing its hidden structures. If you shape it, you intervene in power. And that is precisely the task before us now. Because the digital world is not neutral architecture. It is narrative architecture. It writes us while pretending merely to serve us. Here, postcolonial literature becomes unexpectedly relevant. Magical realism, for example, does not only blur reality for aesthetic effect. It shows how a world can become so saturated with the extraordinary that the extraordinary feels normal. That is how engineered environments work too. The curated feed becomes reality. The recommended view becomes common sense. The synthetic interaction becomes emotional habit. The algorithm does not need to declare itself as a storyteller because it is already doing the storytelling. This is why I think of our present condition as a kind of algorithmic magical realism. What is constructed feels organic. What is predicted feels spontaneous. What is engineered feels like identity. And if that sounds dramatic, it is only because we have become too accustomed to the language of convenience to notice how deep the design has gone. So what does sovereign democracy mean in this context? It does not mean a sentimental return to some imagined past when everything was simpler. That past never existed. It means something more serious and more demanding, designing systems that preserve agency, distribute power, and remain resilient under pressure. It means replacing dependency with capacity. It means ensuring that the social world does not merely deliver outcomes but cultivates judgment. If digital feudalism is built on dependency, sovereign democracy must be built on authorship. And this is where SSQ, social sustainable intelligence, becomes operational rather than merely conceptual. Think of social sustainable intelligence. SSQ as a triangle. At one corner is awareness, the ability to see how systems influence behavior. At the second corner is collective intelligence, the ability to think with others rather than against them, to generate resilience through shared understanding. At the third corner is ethics, the discipline that prevents intelligence from becoming manipulation. That triangle matters, because without it, you can have speed, data, and efficiency, and still be producing social fragility. SSQ corrects for that. It asks not just what works, but what sustains, not just what scales, but what preserves dignity. This is also why ecological intelligence belongs in the same conversation. Real ecosystems are not built on extraction alone. They are built on interdependence, balance, feedback, and adaptation. A healthy forest is not a monoculture. A healthy social order should not be either. Excessive centralization creates fragility. Over-optimization creates brittleness. Systems that ignore feedback eventually fail, sometimes elegantly, sometimes catastrophically. So if we want resilient social structures for future generations, we need to think ecologically, not just technologically. Now let me make that practical. The first requirement is transparency. Systems must be explainable enough to be questioned. Opaque systems produce dependency because they make power legible only to insiders. Transparency is not a cosmetic value, it is a democratic one. The second requirement is human-in-the-loop governance. Automation can assist, but it must not become a substitute for judgment, accountability, or contextual understanding. The third requirement is education for sovereignty. If learners are not trained to think critically about systems, then they will inherit systems they do not understand. That is the educational dimension of this entire argument. And it is where your work becomes especially important, because leaders are not simply people who manage institutions. They are people who design the conditions under which institutions think. That is a much more difficult job and a much more serious one. Leadership today must integrate AIQ, EEQ, and SSQ. AIQ to understand the machine, EEQ to keep the moral center alive, SSQ to ensure that the system remains socially sustainable rather than merely efficient. Without that integration, leadership becomes managerial theatre. It looks active, but it is merely reactive. It sees the dashboard and mistakes it for the road. Now, if I were to give this whole argument a second diagram, I would draw 3 concentric circles. The innermost circle is the self, cognition, attention, judgment. The middle circle is the social field, relationships, institutions, norms. The outer circle is the technical environment, platforms, algorithms, infrastructures. In a healthy democracy, the inner circle remains sovereign, the middle circle remains accountable, and the outer circle remains subordinate to human values. In digital feudalism, those circles invert. The outer circle begins to dictate the middle one, and the middle one begins to colonize the inner one. That is when the self becomes administrated. And that is why this matters so much. Because what is at stake is not only politics, it is the internal life of the citizen. A society can only remain free if people are still capable of independent thought, ethical discernment, and relational responsibility. If they are not, then democracy becomes procedural while sovereignty migrates elsewhere. The real danger of the present moment is not that technology is too powerful. The real danger is that people will mistake convenience for freedom until they no longer know the difference. That is where the future splits. One path deepens dependency, more automation, more centralized control, more extraction disguised as assistance. It will feel efficient, it will feel smooth, it will feel modern. That is precisely why it is dangerous. The other path is harder. It requires discipline, institutional courage, and intellectual honesty. It requires systems that educate rather than seduce, systems that distribute power rather than hoard it, systems that keep the human being at the center, not as a slogan, but as a design principle. That is sovereign democracy, not naive, not decorative, not nostalgic, designed. And here I want to return to Brecht one more time, because he understood that the stage is never only a stage, it is a model of the world. He would have recognized our digital platforms immediately. They are theaters of attention. They stage reality in ways that make the audience feel present while quietly directing the script. So the question is not whether we are being shaped. We are. The question is whether we can become conscious enough to shape back. That is the real work. Not outrage, not nostalgia, not passive critique. Conscious redesign. If you want to go deeper into this architecture, 2 of my books belong right next to this conversation. AIQ Savvy and EQ Shrewd Vanguard Leader is the practical intelligence layer. How to think, decide, and lead in the AI age without surrendering your ethical core. Transformative leadership or emotional alchemists. The power matrix for global leadership in the AI age gives you the wider leadership architecture, the power, the emotional discipline, the systems thinking, the strategic frame. Read them together. They function as a pair. One sharpens the operator, the other strengthens the architect. And yes, buy them in both Kindle and paperback. Kindle gives instant access, portability, and searchability. Paperback gives annotation, depth, and the physical experience of study. Different formats serve different reading habits, and in practical terms, they widen access while strengthening retention. If you are serious about your thinking, the format matters. The future will belong to people who can remain sovereign inside systems that are trying, very politely, to think for them. And that future will not be given, it will be built.